Our gospel lesson can be found on page 81 in your Pew Bible if you would like to follow along. It is Luke chapter 18, verses 9 through 14. It picks up where our lesson last Sunday left off of the unjust judge. Jesus also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, was praying thus, "God, I thank you that I am not like other people, thieves, rogues, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give 1/10 of all my income." But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even look up to heaven, but was beating his breast and saying, "God, be merciful to me, a sinner." I tell you, this man went down to his home justified rather than the other. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and all who humble themselves will be exalted. The word of the Lord. I want to know, what is it with Luke giving us all of these comments before Jesus tells a parable? Last week, Luke began chapter 18 by telling us something about the parable that Jesus was about to tell, that it was a parable about the need to pray always and not to lose heart. But the parable itself had us wrestling with justice and the seeking of justice as an active part of our prayer life. This week, Luke continues in chapter 18 by again telling us something about the parable that Jesus is about to tell. This week, he tells us that it is addressed to those who trust in themselves that they are righteous and regard others with contempt. And so naturally, I'm wondering where we're going to get caught up. It's addressed to them, you know, those people who trust in themselves that they are righteous, not us. So maybe we shouldn't really read it. Maybe we should just pass it up because, well, it's for those who regard others with contempt, and we're not like them. Shoot. I knew I felt a setup here. Who among us has never counted themselves among the righteous? In our society, all of the ways in which we find our personal worth are rooted in righteousness. We find our self-worth in where we went to school, in our alma mater, in our GPA, our ACT, our SAT, our MCAT scores, in where we live, where we work, who we're going to vote for, who our parents are, who our children are, where we go to church, and the number and kinds of things in which we are involved. We struggle to even introduce ourselves to someone without recounting our personal accolades and qualifying the things about ourselves that we think make us worthy of love and belonging. Even when we find common qualities with another, we are likely to compare our worth to theirs. Since you've had a lot of football analogies, I'll give you a basketball one. Oh, so you're a Mavericks fan. Well, did you go to the preseason game? And do you know the names of their new players? No? Well, you must not be a real fan then. And who among us has never regarded others with contempt? It's a trap I'm telling you, Luke's words here are a trap. He talks this nice, clear, straightforward game, but underneath it all, he's secretly lying in wait, weaving his clever, seemingly simple, straightforward narrative, counting on it being only a matter of time before we find ourselves caught. Thank God. My vote is well-informed and educated, not like those other people who are just going to blindly vote according to their political party. Thank God my child doesn't act like that child. I don't know what I would do if I had a child like that. Thank God my church is not as close-minded as that other church. Thank God I'm not in her situation. I don't know how she keeps her head above water. We have a hard time not showing contempt even when we're trying to be humble. We've all said things when we're going through a hard time like, I just try and remember someone else is worse off than me. So whether we know that we're being mean, or we're oblivious to the fact, or even when we're sincerely trying to be humble, our efforts often reduce a person's worth to what they happen to be going through at the time. Be forewarned. Contempt isn't just disdain and despise. It is a lack of respect for their being, for their person, and we can show contempt even for ourselves. When we are born into this world, we all share something in common. We can't make it through this life on our own. Not one of us. Not the weakest, the most challenged, the poorest, but not the wealthiest, the most talented, the tallest, or even the smartest person of all can make it through life on their own. Now, perhaps you were or are lucky enough to have a parent or a grandparent on whom you could depend. But perhaps you didn't. Maybe you had a teacher, a relative, or a friend. But each one of us depended upon at least one other someone in order to survive and thrive. That is the natural state with which we all arrived on this earth. Now, somewhere along the way, we grow up and we lose sight of the fact that we came into this world completely dependent on others for life. And we begin to think that we have to do things all on our own. Somehow, self-sufficiency becomes that mark of maturity. At some point, our stories of how we came into this world begin to be not enough. Our life-giving stories of how we depend on others begins to threaten us. So we think that we can escape those stories by making some of our own. We think we can escape vulnerability and dependency. And so we decide that we can come up with much better stories. And we make them up of self-made millionaires, artists, musicians, self-made businessmen and businesswomen, people who pull themselves up by their very own bootstraps and are able to achieve enormous outward signs of success all on their own. And we like these stories. We like them a lot. We find them inspiring. We often put our hope in them, and we pass them along to our children. We think that those stories can give us a better life than the story with which we were born. Because in our made-up stories, we don't have to feel weak. We don't have to feel afraid or ever be lost. And that sounds really nice. We don't have to talk about those things at all. Or if we do, we can let them occupy this little short space right before the resolution and the happily ever after and pretend like they weren't that big. We like this story because in it, we don't need help from anyone. We don't rely on the mercy or kindness of anyone. We create our own worth, and that feels good. We can always make it look like we knew exactly what we were doing, and that even the bad things in our lives turn out for good. We can always be our own heroes. But here's the problem with those stories. They're not true. In the groundbreaking book, The Soul of Money, Transforming Your Relationship with Money and Life, Lynn Twist writes about our difficulty finding the things that really justify us. She writes, "For me, and many of us, our first waking thought of the day is, I didn't get enough sleep. The second one, I don't have enough time." Whether true or not, that thought of not enough occurs to us automatically before we think to question or examine it. We spend most of our hours and the days of our lives hearing, explaining, complaining, or worrying about what we don't have enough of. We don't have enough exercise. We don't have enough work. We don't have enough profits. We don't have enough power. We don't have enough wilderness. And of course, we don't have enough money. Ever. What begins as a simple expression of a hurried life or a challenged life grows into a justification for an unfulfilled life. We spend lots of time thinking up stories that justify us, and they're nice stories for a while, but eventually we come to realize that all of them can only lead us to one place: death. Not because they cause us to stop breathing, but because they require us to separate from our sources of life, from God and from all of the people who have been sources of life for us, and regard them with contempt. Buying those stories means that we have to forget that we're not all alone on this earth, that we didn't and we can't ever make it all alone on this earth. And the more we read those stories, the more we believe those stories, the more we hear and pass on those stories, the more unable we become to recall all of the people who have saved us time and time again. And sometimes the people who save us surprise us. They can be the ones we know intimately, the ones who love and care for us, clothe us, and feed us. But sometimes they're people we don't know at all. The person who said a kind word to us in the gas station when we were having a bad day. The stranger who stopped to help us change a tire. The nursing aide who gave our grandparent a bath when they were sick and we were still running around trying to figure out what to do. The doctors on the other side of the world who make the medicine that someone you know is taking. We spend so much time creating stories about ourselves to help us belong, all without realizing all of the ways in which we already do belong. Jesus tells us a different story, and he uses parables to help. In Greek, the word parable means comparison. Jesus gives us something different to believe in rather than the stories we think we have to live into in order to be happy. He gives us a better story, one that isn't quite so perfect, one that can be a bit messy, one that requires us to be vulnerable, one that reminds us of our true state of dependence. In the parable that we read today, Jesus helps us dispel the myth that we are barely enough and have to do more to gain God's love and acceptance in order to discover the surprising truth of sufficiency. We are enough already. In order to utter the tax collector's prayer, God, be merciful to me, a sinner, we have to dare to hear a different story, one in which Jesus calls us to imagine a future that does not depend upon any visible circumstance of our lives, but solely on knowing our true nature. We are loved by God. E. Elizabeth Johnson writes that in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus' parables often have a go and do likewise quality that exhorts proper Christian behavior as much as offer a theological disclosure of the realm of God. Luke's parables on prayer in chapter 18 make us wrestle with issues of justice and mercy. If prayer is, as I believe, a way to acknowledge and build our relationships with God, with creation, and each other, then what, according to Luke, does prayer require of us? As it turns out, probably the same thing God does. That we act justly, that we love mercy, and that we walk humbly with our God. Prayer composed of such things requires us to live without self-justification, and that can be surprisingly liberating. Prayer that is focused on justice and mercy can set us free to share God's love with all of God's children without conditions or limits, letting them know too that they are enough already. Amen.